Welcome to Podcast Answers, the show where I help you start and grow your podcast, answering any podcasting questions along the way. That's right, guys. I'm here. I'm still here. It's wow. Like, life is just crazy now. I've got 4 kids and they are all over the place. Not that you want to hear excuses though, but they are super busy. And so for me, it takes me a little bit sometimes to do a Podcast Answers episode. But this episode is one that I thought is super important for us, because essentially, what is RSS? You may have heard it a lot. All of the old school guys know what RSS is. Everybody knows what RSS is if you're an old school guy. But what about those who are new school? Yes, Randy Black, let's go. Randy Black is live with us in the comments and says, let's go. So we're talking today about RSS, what it is, because it's super important, because a lot of times the new school people, new school podcasters, those who have come along since 2020 may not actually know what RSS is, because they just think, hey, I'm going to upload a podcast to YouTube and that's it. No, podcasting is so much more than just a video on YouTube. Now, I do podcast on YouTube, but that's not the only thing that I do. So RSS stands for really simple syndication. And essentially what that is it's like, I'm going to compare it to a radio tower. So if we're going back traditional radio broadcasting, you're going to think of the person behind the mic, and then there's the radio tower and the radio transmitter. RSS is essentially like your radio transmitter. And because essentially on a traditional radio, you speak into the mic, and then it goes up to the tower and gets transmitted out into the universe. And then those with the radio sets can tune into your broadcast. So the RSS is really just the radio tower, and podcast apps are like the radio receiver. They get the signal and allow you to tune in to your show. So at its base, what is RSS? RSS is a text file that has all of the information about your podcast episode. So when a podcaster publishes a new episode, they upload it to their hosting platform, which generates this RSS feed. It's just a text file, but it has information about details about the episode, like the title, the description, the duration, where the audio file is hosted and such, as well as the overall show itself. So title and description of the show. And then what happens is that automatically updates any subscribers. So if you have a Apple Podcast app or any other podcast app in general, it looks every so often. So it checks either 30 minutes or an hour or whatever. It just checks that file and says, hey, is there any new content here? Is there any new episodes for, let's say, Podcast Answers? And if there is, then it knows what the episode is, what the title is, and then tells it to download that file. And so essentially, again, RSS is like just being able to go out, and it's like the transmitter for your podcast. Now, what it allows you to do, and why it's so important, because a lot of newer companies are saying, hey, upload your file here, upload your file here, upload your file here. So for instance, podcasting on YouTube, and I'm putting that in quotes, they want you to upload your podcast video to them. Spotify, if you're doing video with them, wants you to upload to their host. What this allows you to do, RSS, is you upload it once, and then it goes everywhere, because you don't have to, because all of your applications and directories check that file and say, oh, there's a new episode available. So it allows subscription-based delivery. So it allows you to say, subscribe to your favorite podcast, and then it ensures that anytime that a new episode is delivered or published, it gets directly delivered into your podcast app. Users don't have to go manually check back for new content. This is automatic delivery makes following podcasts convenient. It's so easy because you don't have to go to the website and say, "Hey, is there a new episode?" Now, I do publish my episodes on my website. I do have a listing of all of my episodes, and you can play them right from my website. But the beauty of podcasting is you don't have to do that. You can do that right in the app because the app just checks it and it delivers it when there's a new one there. The RSS, again, is your radio tower to your broadcast. The great thing about this too is it's so cross-platform compatible too. All of the apps and all of the directories know how to take in that file. They can it can be hosted on one platform, but as long as your podcast has an RSS feed, it can be picked up by any of the apps anywhere. So again, it doesn't matter if we're going to go back to the radio days here. You're not saying only people who have a Pioneer receiver are going to be able to receive my podcast. You don't want that. You want anybody who can speak radio, right? Anybody who is producing a radio feed, a radio transmission to be able to have their transmission heard by anyone who has a radio. And so RSS is critical to that because it allows you to tell and have any user anywhere listen to anything. And the nice thing about that is because it does get, a lot of apps don't necessarily use their own directories. They either use Podcast Index or they use Apple Podcast. And so as long as you are submitting your show to one of those two directories, you can submit them other places too, but one of those two, a lot of people are going to be able to hear it because they will be able to find your podcast. The nice thing about this too is you have control with an RSS feed. You have control over your content that you publish because you can manage all of your metadata, all of your feed, all of your episodes, ensuring that your updates are distributed exactly like you want. Now, yeah, again, podcast apps may display it differently, and some may display links in your description, some may not. But you have control over that, and you have it in one place. You can go back to your RSS, whoever's creating your RSS feed. Most of the time, that's going to be your podcast host. It's going to be the person that's going to be the place that you're uploading your videos to. But you can go back and change that stuff or pull the episode. I've had an episode that I've had to pull before for content reasons that, I was a guest, besides the point, but I've had to pull it. And so it was really easy for me to pull. And actually that goes back to this, where if you distribute multiple locations with multiple hosts, you have to remember, where did I put that at? Where did I put that episode at? Because for me, when I had to take that episode down, I definitely quickly pulled it right from my RSS feed. And then that made it go away from a good majority of the podcast applications. However, I forgot that I had it on YouTube still. So I went out and I had to remove it from YouTube because they came back to me and said, "Hey, the episode is still available here." And so that was one of the things that I really enjoyed having an RSS feed, because it was really easy for me to pull it from the places that ingest in RSS just by removing the audio file and removing the episode. So that's why it made it super simple and super easy to go out and remove that episode. So again, guys, RSS is critical. A lot of the newer podcast apps podcast players, and I'm going to say that in quotes, YouTube, Spotify, whatever, is allowing it to they're trying to force you into having having your episode uploaded on their site. And this is RSS. We need to keep RSS alive. I'm going to bang on that drum forever, because it is so easy and efficient to deliver it to all of the podcast apps. Now, Randy Black has reminded me in the comments, Podping has revolutionized RSS distribution for podcasting. We need Apple to implement it and save themselves server load on the back end. So I will briefly touch into that. So what Podping is essentially a notification system, a notification bus, because the way traditionally RSS works is my podcast app goes out and says, hey, RSS feed, is there a new episode? And it does that every hour. So that way, when I open my app, I know that there's a new episode, or I can get notified of it. And then there are certain things like Apple Podcasts and other directories, where listing directories, those go out every, how often, 30 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour, or whatever it is, and says, hey, is there a new episode? And so essentially what that does is that puts a whole lot of strain on the episodes, because yes, as Randy's reminded me, it's push versus pull. So pull is normally what your normal RSS is, where you're saying, okay, is there a new episode? Is there a new episode? Is there a new episode? And that's really wasteful, because it has to take server time and server space and server cycles to come back and say, yes, there's a new episode, or no, there's not a new episode. And so what Podping essentially does is it allows directories and apps and everything to listen to this huge giant message feed, right? Essentially it's saying it's on the blockchain, it's on the Hive blockchain, but essentially it's just a listing of podcasts that are updating. And you can go to podping.watch and see this happen live. It's kind of cool. I sometimes have that just webpage up in my podcast, or in my browsers. That way I can see what's happening. But essentially, you could, as a host or a directory, you can have that set to, you can just be watching that. And so every time you see a new episode come up on Podping, then you go out and pull the RSS feed for it. And what Randy is saying here is essentially Apple is a huge player in the podcast complex ecosystem. And so they pull a lot of feeds, a lot. And so their servers are constantly checking, constantly asking for new episodes. And so if they were to implement this, they would not have to do that nearly as often, because there's a lot of podcasts and hosts that are using this Podping technology. In fact, if you're listening to me live right now in a podcast app, a new podcast app, that new podcast app got notified that I went live because I sent a Podping out right before I went live. And so Podping is a great technology, and it's super easy to implement as far as the notification goes. And so, yeah, Randy, I totally agree with you. We need to see, hopefully Apple, and Apple has been listening to podcasting 2.0. They've implemented a lot of the new podcasting tags, not a lot. They've implemented a podcast tag, and they're starting to implement another one here, or they have implemented another one here. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens with Apple over the next couple years or months and stuff, and see if they implement some more of the new tags that we've got over here in podcasting. So that's a brief rundown of it and why it's super important, because again, your RSS feed is your lifeblood to your podcast. Yes, you can have video, and I'm streaming to YouTube right now, and yes, you can do that, but you need to have a broadcast tower. Otherwise, your podcast is not a podcast. I'm just going to go out and say it. It's not a podcast if you don't have a RSS feed or a broadcast. So if you need help, I would love to help you out. If you've got questions, what podcasting questions do you have? Go to podcastanswers.com/ask, and that will allow you to ask your questions for me that I can go ahead and put on an upcoming podcast episode for this show. Again, if you want to ask podcasting questions, I love helping people podcast. And so get out there, ask me some questions for future episodes. If you need help one-on-one, I would love to help you one-on-one, set up your podcast or do something with podcasting for you. You can go to podcastanswers.com/contact. And we can do a one-on-one consult. Thanks, guys. Have a great week and keep podcasting.